Okay, the Lord is good. Praise the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. The Lord God omnipotent reigns. He's the Ancient of Days, the greatest of all. He's greater than all, Jesus said. Jesus didn't say, I'm great and I'm as great as God. No, he said, my Father is greater than me. He says, my Father is greater than all. So, continuing on now in the fourth part on Marcion and Paul, we're really not going to talk about Paul. We're not going to really talk too much about Marcion, but we're exploring the idea that Marcion had that the Old Testament God was a different God than the God of Jesus, the Father of Jesus, because Jesus always said, my Father. You don't hear that very much in the Old Testament. In fact, I think it mentions God as Father once, just once, in the entire Old Testament. Very rare. It was always God, the Lord God, Lord our God. But Jesus was constantly saying that God was his Father and that he was our Father. So right away, that's a major difference. It's something I've determined. It's just strange. You can't figure it all out. You can't really figure or get the answer and totally resolve all the contradictions and the inconsistencies in the Bible or in between the Old and the New Testaments. You can't totally do it. All you can do is compare the two testaments, the two covenants, and then make some kind of a determination. One determination I've made is that the last instance where God commanded the king of Israel or the leader of Israel to kill everybody in the city was in the time of Saul, King Saul. And I went over that, but I think that's a point in time that's very interesting, that he commanded that of Saul, but then after that, you don't see that anymore. Even David, with all the wars that he was engaged in, you don't hear any commandments come through any prophet saying, thou shalt go and kill all the people in. And why? We have no idea. They were probably more able, right? They were as able as ever in the day of David to do that, but there's nothing like that. So that is a strange thing to consider. I have always said, or I've said many times, and I've affirmed recently, that God is a man of war. Because that's what he was called the day of Moses, when he drowned everybody in the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. And they were following along, which you'd think they would not have dared do it, since all the firstborn in the city in Egypt died. You'd think they wouldn't have dared to do it. But somehow or another we see them following them. Oh, you want more? Well, they got more. So, stories like that, to me, there's a bunch of things like that in the accounts of Moses that don't make any sense with all the power that they saw. All the power that the Israelites saw, and they still were complaining and not believing sufficiently. And then they had to be killed. Many of them were killed at one point. The same way they were saved. So they were saved, and then in the wilderness, or after they left Egypt, they were killed. So that was a big difference between the Old and New Testaments. God, up until the point of Saul, was really a man of war, clearly. And nothing like that is spoken of about the Father of Jesus, who is God. And clearly it's a totally different personality. It's a totally different person. And after Saul, then we have David, and then Solomon, and then later on they were attacked rather than having them attack. And there didn't even seem to be any type of connection between God and the Israelites or the people of Israel. They were just living their lives, and many of these kings were not believers, and they just didn't even believe. Many of the kings that came after Solomon were unbelievers, and so the people became unbelievers, and then eventually they were conquered by other countries. Instead of they going after the other countries, the countries came after them, which is totally not the same as it was before that. And you can only guess why, there was no leadership. That's the key word. There didn't seem to be any real leadership, and why not? If you have this amazing God, why can't he communicate with the people and get them to do the right thing? Yeah, you don't know why that is. People just drifted away, but then we had, although I must mention the time when 185,000 soldiers were killed. I can't think of the name of that king. But there were some good kings in the time after Solomon, but they were in the minority. But then there was a time when the people were apparently doing the right thing and the king was good, and so God killed 185,000 soldiers in one night. And I've always said, well, how in the world did that happen? So you had 185 corpses. Were they taken back? No. They weren't taken back to the country. They were left there. So you have 185,000 people that died in one spot, that were camped out, and then what did they do with that? Well, they don't mention a word about that. They don't say anything about that. As if it's no biggie. Oh, it's only 185,000 dead bodies in one spot. But there's no mention, nothing. All right, now that I've gone on about whatever's on my mind, let's begin looking at the different verses, because this is where the rubber meets the road. The first verse I want to read is John 10:37 and 38. I think this is very important, because I'm going to say a lot of things where I don't like what Jesus said, but Jesus said it was all right. Jesus said it was all right not to like or believe what he said. He didn't say many cases, but I would say in many cases, if you don't believe what he said in many cases, he said it was all right. He didn't even say that, so according to him, you could not believe him at all. But he wanted you to believe the works And that's what I say to people that don't believe. I say, Jesus raised somebody who was dead for 4 days. Their body had been decomposed. It was seriously decomposed. It turned into water. They say between 3 and 5 days the body is decomposed if you don't put it on ice. But yet Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and he was back in business, walking around again. So the body was completely, or 80%, who knows, decomposed, and yet the body was restored to a working order again. I mean, that's just beyond belief. That's just amazing, to say the least. It says, if I do not the works of my Father, believe me not. But if I do, though you believe not me, believe the works. You see? Though you believe not me, so you don't believe me, just believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. Right? So only God can raise a dead body that's been dead for 4 days. The next verses I want to look at is Mark 9:43 through 48. And so I put here, self-mutilation is recommended section. Because this is one of the most annoying, I think this is the most annoying verses in the entire New Testament. These verses right here coming up. For many different reasons. Verse 43, and if your hand offends you, cut it off. Now, your hands don't offend you. This really, none of this talk in these verses make any sense. They really don't make any sense. Because a hand doesn't have a brain. A hand isn't like an entity that has a mind and thinks on its own. That's ridiculous. If your hand offends you, cut it off. And then he's recommending you, if your hand somehow has a mind and it offends you, then you want to chop it off? That's brutal. That's terrible talk. That's a terrible analogy. And that's people have actually done stuff to themselves. I've heard of it when he talks about the eye. I'm going to read that. They hurt themselves. That's all I'm going to say. Because they're crazy. Anyway, So it says, if your hand offends you, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed. Well, your body's not even going to go into life. Your spirit is going in. So your body has nothing. Your body's going to be decomposed. It's going to be bones if you're not burned. Some people like to burn the body. But then that's not Christian. That's not biblical. To burn your body after death. Cremation. It's not biblical. I mean, they saved the bones of Joseph for hundreds of years. And they took them when they left Egypt. So cremation is not a Christian or a Jewish practice by any means. The Hindus do that. And other people. So the body, you're not going to enter into life with a main body. You're not even going to have the body. The body's going to be decomposed. It turns into water. The organs decompose and they just become like liquid. And then, well, I don't want to get into it. I looked into it the other day. It's not a pretty picture. The body bloats and all the organs decompose, and you end up and if it's untouched in the woods, it doesn't take very long before it just, your clothes and your bones, and that's it. There's not going to be anything else left. And so that's a very discouraging reality, since this is the reality that we know. And this other reality of afterlife, it seems distant and it seems not real, So he's saying, then having two hands to go into hell. So supposedly he's claiming the body can go into hell with two, with both hands. The body, if you cut off a physical part of your body, you don't cut off your spirit. At least I believe that. I can't even prove it. But I think that's pretty safe to say. Because if the whole body is dead and people live on, which I believe they do, I believe they're living in the center of the earth. I believe everybody that's died is existing in the center of the earth in two separate sides. A good place and a place that isn't so good. And that's really all we know. And we don't even know that very well either. And we don't even know that very well either. But then it says, into the fire that never shall be quenched. And I clearly believe that, totally believe that that means that you can't put out the fire. It puts you out, right? So you really don't exist in the fire. It puts you out. One of these days I might do that message I've talked about. But that is clearly what a person wants to believe, that believes in the Bible and Jesus and so forth, is that they're not going to be living in the fire. The fire is just, they're going to not have the ability to put the fire out. You see? The fire that it shall never be quenched. In other words, you can't get a hose of water. There's no fire hoses, fire extinguishers that you can use, supposedly. Supposedly. Why not? Why don't they make some? That's how much we know about the afterlife. Nothing. Close to nothing. And they keep to those rules, the gods. They make sure nobody really knows about the afterlife. But I have heard people speak to me, my mother, clearly, very, very minimally, I might add. There's no conversation with dreams and a voice and like that, but other than that, don't know anything. We don't know anything. But then now this verse of verse 44 is repeated 3 times in the King James and in the different versions that have the Textus Receptus as their Greek text. But it's not 3 times in all the versions. I just confirmed that it's only like 1 time in a lot of them, instead of 3 times. But it appears that it is 1 time, at least 1 time. But there may be some that don't have any of that statement, where it says, verse 44, where their worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. In other words, the worms of decay are not going to die. They're going to have their way, you see. And the fire, you won't be able to put it out. Then he goes on again about the foot. It says, if your foot offends you, cut it off. The same type of thing as the hand. And, it's better to enter into life crippled, halt, whatever, having 2 feet to enter into hell, cast into hell. So God is going to cast people into hell, into a furnace of fire. I mean, that's what Jesus taught, that people will be put into a furnace of fire. And it doesn't even say that in the Old Testament. And then it's repeated again, the worm dies not, fire is not quenched. And then he uses the eye as an example. He says, if your eye offends you, and that's why people have hurt their eyes, I've heard. It says, better for you to enter into the kingdom of God with 1 eye. No, you have a spirit. You're not going to have either eye. You're not going to have any of the body, the hand, the foot, or the eye. Nobody is going to enter into the kingdom of God with any of their body parts. They're going to have some kind of a spirit body. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the physical body. If it did, how could it? I mean, how could it? If the body completely dies, it doesn't matter what happens to the body. The body turns back to dust, basically, and the bones, and then eventually they decay too. And if they were out in the elements, they would decay, I would imagine. And then the fire is not quenched again, the worm dies not. So the teaching on hell and the hellfire being cast into hell, fire, that's worse than any of the things in the Old Testament. There's not even any teaching on that in the Old Testament. So according to that, you wouldn't even think that people live on after death, according to the Old Testament. And so moving on, Matthew 5:31 and 32. And that appears, those verses are in Mark, but I just read, but it appears also in Matthew 5. This is right after the section on self-mutilation. The ridiculous talking about self-mutilation in Matthew. So it says, it has been said, and I wrote, by who? Said by who? Whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. So first of all, he's saying that it was just said by some people or whatever. Just said. Somebody said it. But it was a commandment of God, supposedly. We've been led to believe that. But he says, but I say to you, see, he's saying something different. But I say to you, so he's saying something different. Whoever shall put away his wife except for the cause of fornication. And I wrote in what that really means. It means adultery, sex with somebody else. So you have sex with somebody else. If somebody who's married has sex with somebody else, then that is your legal grounds or grounds to divorce them. But if they don't do that, then it says, it goes on to say, will cause her to commit adultery. So you're going to, this is what Jesus taught, right? He's saying if you divorce somebody and they haven't had sex with somebody else, then you're going to cause them to have the sin of adultery, commit the sin of adultery. Because they're going to, obviously because they're going to go to somebody else and then they're going to have sex with them, and then that'll be adultery with the other relationship. Obviously. I finally put that into words. And then it goes on, it says, whoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. So that he gives you half of the game right there, but he's really saying that the person who marries her will commit adultery, but so does the girl. He's talking about a woman in this case, but it will work the other way. It works on the man's side the same way. And then it's amazing that he's saying that, if somebody divorces. So in this case, he's talking about a woman who divorces a man who didn't have sex with somebody else, okay? So she goes off into the world to find a new mate, and now she's supposedly not really divorced, according to Jesus. She's supposedly still married. What if the man is beating her? Always beating up on her, beating her. Isn't that grounds to divorce? Of course it is. So she goes off into the world now, and the other guy, all he does is beat her. All he does is beat her. He doesn't have sex with anybody else. Okay? And she goes off into the world, and she finds somebody else. And then supposedly she's committing adultery. Well, that can't be right. He was beating her. There's no option for that. He didn't say anything about that. They have fist fights together, right? And she's all black and blue, and her eyes are black and blue. And then she's not supposed to divorce him? But that's what some men do. They beat on the woman. And then he's claiming that whoever would marry her, she goes off, she gets away from the man, divorces him, and then marries somebody else, then the person that marries her is supposedly committing adultery because, she's supposedly still married. No, she's not. And that's ridiculous. I mean, she was getting beat up. She's having fist fights with her husband. Why should she be still married? She's not married at all. So I'm glad I finally got that straight. Put that into words. So here's the Leviticus. This is the whole section in Leviticus. I'll put some space in that out of the GNB. And this is, actually, I couldn't resist but include all these verses, okay? Because I just said, these are so important to talk about. I could have just had the verses on adultery, just whatever. I could have had just a couple of these verses. But instead, it's like 7 of them. And I just think it's important to realize what is in the book of Leviticus, the books of Moses. And I think it's very good. I think these commandments are very, very good, and they're very clear, too. So this is almost like a different God because it's so clear than the God of Jesus. But yet we see that Jesus was even more stricter than this, but almost to a ridiculous point. Let me read these verses. Leviticus 29 through 16. And the Lord gave the following regulations. Any of you that curse your father or mother shall be put to death. You are responsible for your own death. So this was the case where Jesus accused the scribes and Pharisees of being hypocrites when they accused him of not keeping the law. And they said, well, you don't put to death anybody that curses father or mother, so you're hypocrites too. But this is what the teaching was, that they were to kill the children. It doesn't give ages, really, about how old how old do you start doing this? When they're like 3 years old? No. 5 years old? No. 8 years old? Who knows? But the teaching is that if you have a son who hates the parents and curses them, then they were supposed to stone them, kill them. And that's pretty radical. That is something that most people are not going to do. Most people. Verse 10, if a man commits adultery with the wife of an Israelite, both he and the woman shall be put to death. So, and I'm going to read the account of Jesus. I can't wait to do that, because it's going to be very interesting comparing that with this. So we have the death penalty. If you committed adultery with a woman, a married woman, then the penalty, and this was given by God, the penalty was death. If a man had sexual relations with a woman who was married already, then they were to be put to death, put down, executed, stoned. They didn't have guns then. They didn't have electric chairs. They didn't have injections. They didn't have injections or any other form of death penalty. But it gets even heavier here. Verse 11, a man who has intercourse with one of his father's wives. So he's a real wild guy, that one. So this person that would do that, that's what the son of David was doing with all the concubines. That's a whole nother story. Concubines, mistresses that David had and Solomon supposedly had hundreds, but it's far-fetched. Well, he had 300 concubines, Solomon, and 700 wives, it says. But I think it's exaggeration. But this guy, he didn't have any respect for his father's wives, and he was having intercourse with one of them. It says, disgraces his father, and both he and the woman shall be put to death. They are responsible for their own death. So another death penalty. If somebody were to do that, and then both of them. And it's good to mention that, with the adultery on the previous verse, both he and the woman shall be put to death. Not just the one who's not married, but the one who is married. They were supposed to be killed. They were to be killed. Okay. And same thing with this son of somebody who had intercourse with his father's wife. The wife is to be killed too. It says, both he and the woman, or the wife, were to be killed. Okay. Verse 12, if a man has intercourse with his daughter-in-law, that would be the daughter of his wife from another marriage or another relationship, they shall both be put to death. So it wasn't allowed to do that. If you married a woman and she had a real hot daughter, hands off. Don't touch her. They have committed incest and are responsible for their own death. And they once again, both of them were to be put to death. Even the daughter-in-law and the man. That's what was supposed to happen. Both of them were to be killed. Let me move that up. 13. Now we're looking at 13. If a man has sexual relations with another man, is that right? They have done a disgusting thing, correct? And both shall be put to death. So homosexuality, gay behavior, the way they say now, no, it wasn't tolerated. It was a death penalty. If they could catch the people doing it somehow. They are responsible for their own death. Verse 14, if a man marries a woman and her mother. So, he was going to marry the mother. And, well, it's hard to say how old is the man. We don't know. So maybe he was the same age as the daughter. But either way, all three were to be burned this time. I find that quite amazing. So if he marries a woman and then his mother or her mother is attractive and desirable, they said, well, all three of us will get together, So he'll marry the mother too and marry the daughter. Apparently that was a big no-no. That was a big no-no. All three were to be burned to death. Burned. Not just stoned, but burned. Doesn't say anything about stoning, it just says burned. There's no account of that. I really don't think there is. There's no account in the books of Moses about a case of that happening. Because of the disgraceful thing they have done, such a thing must not be permitted among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he and the animal shall be put to death. So, no bestiality. That was completely, and they were to kill the animal and the man. And then they want to cover both sides of the coin. If a woman tries to have sexual relations with an animal, she and the animal shall be put to death. They are responsible for their own death. And so that is not permitted, of course. That's totally grotesque. So I'm going to finish up on these verses here and quickly move through these in John, because they're about what I just talked about. I find it quite amazing. John 8, 4 through 11. So, this is very good. John, some things in John I don't like, but this is very good that they have this account here, because it's not found in any other gospel. Verse 4, they say to him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. So somehow they caught the woman in the act of having sex with some man. And she was already married. The man was not her husband. I like that it says master. They don't use that word in a lot of the versions. Then it says, now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? First of all, I want to say, the amazing thing is that Jesus should have said to them, where is the man? Where is the man? No. Nothing was said, supposedly. Nothing. Because, as we just read, both of them were to be killed, okay? Both of them. But these hypocrites, they were bringing the woman, and they weren't apparently bringing the man, who was supposed to be murdered, executed, killed, put down. So then it says in verse 6, this they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. Yeah, they were testing him. That's what that means, tempting, testing. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. And we don't even know what it was that he was trying to write on the ground. And I say, why are you down on the ground writing Please get back up off the ground. We don't even know what it was. So then it says, so when they continued asking him, so he's on the ground, writing on the ground, he lifted up himself. So they kept pestering him. Come on, Jesus, what are you doing down there? He lifted up himself and said to them, he that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her. In verse 8, and again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. So again, he doesn't say anything else except that if all you people are so perfect, just start stoning her. But the commandment of God was to stone her. It wasn't say, well, we're not perfect either, so we're not going to do it. That wasn't the commandment. It was totally not the commandment. This is a totally new commandment that Jesus he's changing the law, totally changing it. Totally saying something that is in opposition, that is against, that is contrary to what God had commanded the people in the day of Moses. Once again, we don't know what he's writing on the ground. In verse 9, and they which heard it being convicted by their own conscience. Also, all those people were adulterers? I don't think so. But I can see why they wouldn't want to do it. I wouldn't do it. Went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even to the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are your accusers? Has no man condemned you? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So, that's good. But the problem is, it's not like what the law of Moses said. No, it's a totally new thing. It's a new law. Jesus is saying, no, that's not the law anymore. I'm changing the law, and I'm doing away with it, basically. So that's a different God. I mean, why did God give these commandments if later on he was going to say, well, don't do them anymore. I'm not interested in seeing these laws obeyed anymore. I'm not that strict anymore. I'm not, I don't even care anymore. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You can commit adultery and no problem. Just no problem. Just don't do it anymore. Don't do it anymore. Is that all? Just don't do it anymore? Well, so that's what happened. And did she not do it anymore? Well, nobody knows. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if she did do it again, because there was no penalty. Of course, the death penalty is extreme. That she would never been able to do anything anymore if they had exacted the penalty. And what hypocrites! They didn't even bring the man. The man was supposed to be killed too. Why didn't Jesus say that? Something's not right. Why didn't Jesus say, well, where is the man? That would have been the correct response. Where is the man, you hypocrites? They would have left right then and there. That would have been the end of it. They all would have left because they didn't want to bring the man. No, they want the woman to be killed. And the man can go free. Well, sorry. Maybe you haven't read the book.